They smelled it before they saw it, a wet, sour rot that seemed to hang in the cold air like a second, unwelcome season. It clung to the boys' jackets and rose up from the undergrowth as if the earth itself had opened and exhaled something foul. Britain was in the grip of the 1963 Big Freeze, trains stalled, rivers iced over, and conversations at kitchen tables turned to weather and rationing of coal. But alongside the freezing fog and shuttered windows, another kind of story began to circulate. Reports of odd lights, shadowy figures on lonely roads, and, in a few places, things that made people put Sunday church business aside and speak quietly of ritual and desecration. One of those places was a modest patch of woodland on the edge of Caddington, in Bedfordshire. Locals call it Bluebell Wood in seasons of bloom. On some maps it appears as Badgerdell or simply Roundwood. It was the sort of small stand of trees that sat like a punctuation mark between fields and a scattering of houses. A brambly edge, a well-worn footpath, the faint hum of traffic on Sundon Road in the distance. For most of the year, it was anonymous. But in March of 1963, two 12-year-old boys out on an afternoon walk stumbled into a scene that would send ripples through the neighborhood for decades. They had been following a furtive animal trail when the smell hit them. They pushed through a screen of bramble and into a small clearing that seemed to have been pressed flat by something heavy. The grass lay in concentric rings, as if some invisible hand had walked in spirals around the center. At the middle stood a gnarled tree, its roots like knuckles, and scattered around its base were odd, dark shapes. The boys thought at first they were lumps of earth, then realized they were heads, the severed heads of livestock. According to reports given to local authorities and later compiled by researchers, there were 6 cow heads and 1 horse head. Eyes and lower jaws were missing from some. Others bore cuts described by investigators as precise, almost surgical. One eye, investigators later reported, was found dangling from a branch nearby. The boys ran for home. Local authorities, the police and the RSPCA were called. Those initial reports, cautiously worded, noted several things that made the scene unusual beyond its horror. There were no clear tracks leading in or out of the clearing, as if no one had approached it by the usual routes. The cuts on the carcasses did not resemble the ragged tearing of scavengers. Several officers later described them as deliberate and clean. Bodies that would normally be expected near such a scene, the rest of the animals, the evidence of a farmer's frantic search, were not found. For some investigators, the combination of precise cutting, the arrangement of the heads, and the absence of obvious human footprints suggested something ritualistic. For others, it was a baffling, if grim, puzzle without a neat explanation. News of the discovery did not stay between the farmers and the constables. It sifted through pub talk and quiet corned beef dinners, moving outward into the surrounding villages, Sundon, Slip End, Clophill. It arrived in the parish churches as an uncomfortable subject and into the hands of a few amateur researchers who kept notebooks of local oddities. Clophill nearby had already registered a separate unease that spring. There were reports documented in local accounts and later discussed by investigators of desecrated church property and odd ritual paraphernalia found around the village. Whether there was a connection between those items and the heads in Bluebell Wood was, at the time, a matter of rumor and conjecture, the kind of association that can harden into certainty if retold often enough. What is certain is that the incident left a scar on the community's memory, a place where ordinary lines between farmyard life and something stranger had been blurred. I've spent years following leads like these, small stubborn threads where official records, local memory, and human fear intersect. The scene in Bluebell Wood has become one of those threads. It is the anchor in a larger weave of accounts that span decades across a surprisingly tight patch of countryside. When you begin to line up those reports, the animal mutilations, the shadowy road encounters, the small luminous figures, the nighttime hulking shapes that left people shaking, a pattern starts to worry at the edges of coincidence. But it's crucial to keep 2 things in mind from the outset. First, the evidence is a mix of police notes, RSPCA statements, local recollection, and later retellings. And second, people who were there then are still people now, with memories that have aged and been retold. Respect for witnesses and caution with interpretation are not just good manners, they are methodological necessities. A few miles from Bluebell Wood on Sundon Road, another story from that same winter circulated in sharper, stranger strokes. A man named Tony Brohall reported a series of encounters that, when told together, read less like coincidence and more like the flicker of a presence that could be felt more than seen. According to accounts recorded in local archives and later referenced by researchers who compiled the area's strange history, Tony described a silent silhouette that seemed to occupy the roadside as if it had been waiting for traffic to thin. In one reported incident, a car slowed as if a child was stepping out, then accelerated only to find no one there. On another night, Tony claimed he was pushed, not physically struck but shoved by something that left him off balance and unnerved, and later heard an odd whistling nearby when he turned his head. There were reports of a motorcyclist who experienced a close call on the same stretch of road, feeling a presence pass along the verge at speed, though nothing was found afterward. The tone of Tony's descriptions is sober rather than theatrical. He did not offer triumphal pronouncements. He relayed incidents that left him warier of that road at night. Those accounts sit in the same ledger as the Bluebell Wood discovery, not because they match visually, they don't, but because they share an unsettling trait. They occur in liminal places, the thresholds between one kind of space and another, roads at night, small woods, the approaches to village churches. They are places where, for reasons that may be psychological, environmental, or genuinely anomalous, people report encounters with things that do not fit neatly into their everyday categories. A curious feature of many of these recollections is how a detail lodged itself in the minds of witnesses: the absence or suppression of ordinary noise. Tony's encounter included that swallowed quiet, a hush in which mechanical things seemed to hesitate. The boys in Bluebell Wood said they had first noticed the smell and only then the shapes. The sensory order is inverted from what we expect. These inversions, smell before sight, silence before movement, recur in many accounts from the area and make them feel less like misperception and more like windows into a different kind of event, one that takes place on the margins of perception. 4 years after that first spring of cold and the animal heads, in the summer of 1967, a different kind of witness statement found its way into an even stranger archive. The Flying Saucer Review, a periodical that catalogued UFO reports and related oddities, published an account from a group of boys on Studham Common. The story, as recorded in the magazine and in subsequent compilations, involves 7 children who described seeing a small, luminous figure walking across a patch of common land. They used the words blue man, a small glowing shape with what they described as a hat, and something that could be read as a beard. Smoke or a low mist was reported to have gathered around it, and the figure was said to vanish in that smoke, leaving behind a light like the flare of a match. The boys' descriptions, remarkably, matched one another with a level of consistency that surprised investigators at the time. Why is this relevant to a place like Bluebell Wood? Because Studham Common sits within the same regional tapestry, another loosened stitch in the map where the unusual seems to occur with curious frequency. The blue man narrative is not visually consistent with severed animal heads or with a black dog stalking a lane, but it repeats a pattern of ephemeral figures that appear then dissipate, a kind of brief, bright presence that resists being pinned down. The Flying Saucer Review treated the case seriously enough to devote space to it, and later researchers have returned to those published essays as part of an effort to see whether the scattered incidents were isolated flashes of folklore or threads of something more coherent. What stands out in the Studham account is the way the boys recall the scene in sensory fragments: brightness, the smell of smoke, a sudden hush, the metallic tang of surprise on their tongues. When children are the witnesses, accounts often carry an immediacy that adults trained to second-guess perception lose. But they also present a challenge. Children can be suggestible. Group dynamics can cohere around an image. For that reason, investigators who revisited the case emphasized the need to cross-reference the boys' statements with contemporaneous diaries, school attendance books, and other records. In this instance, the consistency across multiple tellings and the fact that the same narrative appeared in more formalized reporting to the magazine gave the account a weight that cancelled out some, but not all, of the usual skeptical replies. There is another strand that needs to be followed here, because it will be important later on. The area around Luton, Clophill, and these satellite commons had an odd prehistory with light reports and unexplained apparitions stretching back into earlier decades. Local guides and compilations by folklorists and paranormal investigators have noted sightings in the 1950s of luminous objects and roadside shadows, and these were sometimes picked up in the small, specialized journals that catalogued such events. To connect them as proof of a single phenomenon would be premature. To ignore their recurrence entirely would be careless. Instead, the sensible approach is to document, compare, and then try to understand what might link them. A geological fault producing electromagnetic effects, a social contagion that amplifies rumors into events, or something that adapts its appearance to cultural expectation. Each hypothesis has been proposed in one form or another by those who study high strangeness. But even before theoretical framing becomes useful, there is a raw human response to these stories that deserves attention. When the mutilated heads were found, people in the surrounding communities did not simply shrug and move on. They tended their animals more closely, walked with companions after dusk, and some began to avoid certain parts of the woods entirely. The boys who reported the Blue Man carried an image with them through adolescence. Tony Broel's nights on Sundon Road acquired a different tempo. Places collect these traces. They remember them in the conversations of their residents and in the cautious habits that spread through a village like moss. That social memory changes how future events are perceived. A person who knows a road has a history is more likely to interpret a shadow at the verge as significant. That does not on its own explain the physical oddities reported. The precise cuts on animal remains, an eye later found hung on a branch, the absence of tracks. But it does shape the narrative field in which such incidents are recounted. After the Blue Man of Studham Common, the storyline in this part of Bedfordshire takes on a darker, more animal intelligence in the accounts that follow. In 1979, near the motorway tunnel outside Dunstable, a boy named Colby Pope, then still a child, reported an encounter that would later be cited by researchers tracing Mothman and Owlman motifs across Britain. Colby described a creature roughly 8 feet tall, winged or at least wing-like in its silhouette, with an owl-like face that glowed in the gloom. He and other children were reportedly walking near a tunnel used as a shortcut when the creature pursued them in a way that felt predatory rather than merely uncanny. They fled. The tunnel offered a strange kind of sanctuary. Later, the sky was said to flash, an after-image many witnesses associated with their escape. The parallels to other UK cases are compelling. An owl-like figure in a small town recalls the reports from Cornwall and Nottinghamshire that have become part of a larger British folklore of uncanny bird-like humanoids. Again, to leap from similarity to identity would be to betray the careful posture the evidence demands. But the recurrence of an avian motif in different towns invites inquiry. Why do certain shapes appear again and again? Is it a matter of cultural templates, an expectation of monsters shaped by storybooks and cinema? Or is there something that genuinely prefers that outline when it chooses to appear? And then there is the account from the mid-1980s that many long-term residents mention in the same breath as the heads and the Blue Man. An encounter with a black dog on a country lane at dawn that behaved in ways no ordinary animal should. In 1986, an ex-soldier named Tim Humphrey, together with a companion called Tommy, set out one evening on a hunt. They described an atmosphere that became, they said, unearthly. A keen silence, a drop in the usual countryside sounds, and the feeling that they were being watched. At one point, they heard a low growl. Yellow lights gleamed from between hedgerows. What followed in their retelling reads like a tale lifted from a northern English legend of the Black Shuck, a dog larger than a mastiff, with eyes like coals. Tim fired at the creature, witnesses later reported, but the dog, if it was a dog, was always somehow elsewhere in the blink between shots. One moment blocking the lane, the next appearing at the hedge, negating the trajectory of a bullet. Eventually the men fled. In the weeks that followed, local people stitched the story into the existing tapestry of oddness. Tim later associated the experience with a private grief, his grandfather's death, but he did not claim that the encounter had caused it. He framed it as part of a sequence of unsettling things that had become entangled in his family's memory. That restraint of causation is a responsible way to hold narrative and personal life together. Experience does not always lead to explanation, and personal loss and uncanny events can coexist without one proving the other. Taken individually, each of these stories, the heads in Bluebell Wood, Tony's road silhouette, the blue man on Studham Common, Colby Pope's winged figure, Tim's black dog, can be plausibly folded into mundane explanations. Predators and scavengers account for animal remains more often than ritualists. Shadows and fatigue account for roadside sightings. Children can, through group dynamics, elaborate a striking shared image. But there is a stubborn fact about the geography of this part of Bedfordshire. The reports are not homogeneous, and yet they cluster. Different shapes, different senses of menace, differing times and contexts, yet threaded through the same local map. That clustering is what transforms a series of anecdotes into a problem worthy of more patient investigation. It is here that the thought experiments of researchers like Jacques Vallée become useful, not as declarations of truth, but as tools for thinking. Vallée proposed them in different terms, and with caveats that are often elided in popular retellings, that certain anomalous phenomena might represent a kind of adaptive intelligence. Rather than being fixed in appearance or purpose, such a phenomenon could present different faces to different observers, perhaps tuned to cultural expectations. In Vallée's view, the mask could be anything from a glowing man to a black dog to a luminous object in the sky. Applied to Bedfordshire, his idea offers a framework to ask whether the bizarre variety of sightings might be compatible with a single underlying agent or process, one that alters its presentation to fit its context. That hypothesis is not, and must never be treated as, proof. It is a heuristic, a way to ask whether the repeated presence of high strangeness across a defined topography points toward an organizing principle. Other hypotheses compete with it. Electrical anomalies produced by underground geology that affect perception and animal behavior. Social contagion, where rumors harden into retellings that everyone later treats as memory. Vandals or opportunists exploiting a region's reputation. The point is not to choose among these explanations at the outset, but to keep careful notes and to let the weight of the evidence, however messy, accumulate. After the Blue Man account, after the scattered lights recorded in the 1950s and the uncanny dog of the 1980s, there came an event that, in my work, kept nudging me back to Bluebell Wood. It was not a new kind of phenomenon, but rather a recurrence of the old ones in a pattern that refused to be coincidental. Families who had lived in the area for generations reported fresh, odd disturbances. A flock of sheep bolting as if a predator had passed through with silent paws, a roadside whistling that some drivers later insisted had unnerved them, an animal carcass found with anomalies that echoed the cutting patterns of 1963. Each of these smaller incidents by itself might be filed away under local peculiarities. Together they began to look like nodes on a map, place markers of a phenomenon that flirted with the edges of perception. This is where patience becomes a virtue in an investigator's work. The dramatic flourish, the accusation of ritual, the headline that pronounces a village cursed, will always be tempting. But my job, and the job of any serious chronicler of strange events, is to hold many possibilities in the mind at once, to respect the trauma, to honor the witness, to note the physical details the police recorded, and to recognize that the absence of a neat cause is not a void, but an invitation to more careful inquiry. Bluebell Wood is not a single story, but a locus where multiple stories intersect. The most responsible narration of the place is an account that keeps its voice measured, while letting the strangeness remain strangeness. Still, the human impulse is to try to see a shape in the scatter. Residents ask, aloud or to themselves, is this a hotspot? Is there a hazard here? Is there a person or a group or a process that returns and leaves marks? To answer any of those questions with confidence requires more than narrative patterns. It requires corroboration, contemporaneous records, physical evidence preserved and tested, reliable eyewitness testimony that has been subjected to careful cross-examination. In some instances in Bedfordshire, we have fragments of that corroboration. RSPCA notes, police reports that mark dates and items seized, contemporary newspaper clippings that capture the way a community first registered these events. In others, memory fills the gaps. As investigators, we must keep both in play. When I first read the RSPCA and police reports from 1963, what struck me, and still does, is the dissonance between method and mystery. The officers who attended the Bluebell Wood scene wrote in the language of the job: measurements, times, condition of remains. Their detachment, procedural and professional, is not the same as the raw horror a boy might feel facing severed heads. But it is important because it offers a baseline, what was recorded by people with a duty to document rather than by storytellers who might be shaping memory. Those records do not solve the mystery, but they anchor it in the material world. And yet there are gaps no paper can fill. The boys' flushed faces as they bounded back to their homes, the way villagers avoided a certain stretch of lane after dusk, the long, patient conversation at the parish hall the night the heads were discussed among neighbours. These are the human textures that make the Bluebell Wood narrative more than a curiosity. They also complicate it, because social memory can amplify a single incident into a recurring narrative. The moral here is not skepticism for its own sake, but skepticism as a method of listening, an approach that honors witness testimony while demanding corroboration. By the time you have traced the line from that spring day in 1963 through Tony's roadside encounters and up to the boys on Studham Common, a pattern begins to outline itself, if only in suggestion. The phenomenon, if it is a phenomenon, prefers the edges of woods, edges of roads, edges of days. It appears to some as an animal, to others as a small luminous man, to still others as a presence that is felt rather than seen. Those differences matter, because they push us toward theoretical humility. A theory that insists on only one explanation for all of this will inevitably fail to account for the richness of the reports. A theory that allows for adaptation, for masking, or for multiple overlapping causes has a better chance of accommodating the data. But it is only a beginning. At the same time, we must acknowledge the straightforward sociological account that communities with a reputation for strangeness will attract the attention of the curious, the bored, and the prankster. Reputation can act as a magnet, drawing in mischief and interpretation that later becomes memory. That is an uncomfortable thought for people who lived through the events and felt them keenly. It is also a necessary check. Every hypothesis must face the counter-argument that social dynamics can create a story world in which the improbable becomes believable because everyone around you accepts it as part of their landscape. There is a tension at the heart of investigating a place like Bluebell Wood, the desire to explain versus the obligation to refrain from overclaiming. You want to provide the community an answer. You also want to leave open the honest uncertainty that good evidence sometimes compels. In the end, perhaps the most responsible posture is to lay the documents, to write the witness statements with care, and to fashion interpretations as what they are, possible readings of a textured living record, not certainties to be pinned like a specimen. But even as I insist on caution, I'm aware of the pull these stories exert. They are not merely anecdotes about curious lights and mutilated heads. They are narratives that change how people move through a landscape. They affect whether a child is allowed to play near the trees at dusk, whether a farmer checks his fences more often, whether a parish council debates the strange things found near the churchyard. They are, in short, part of the social life of the place. To attend to them is to attend to a living history that refuses to be reduced to simple categories. There is one more detail from the Bluebell Wood discovery I should add before moving on, because it is the sort of small fact that stubbornly refuses to be swept into either explanation or dismissal. Several weeks after the initial find, an RSPCA officer reported finding an eye on a low branch not far from the central tree. It was described as having been stranded there as if placed or hung, neat and deliberate enough that investigators recorded it with puzzled, sober language in their notes. Whether it was intended as a message, part of a ritual, or the result of the work of animals or misinterpretation, I cannot say. What I can say is this: details like that, the way they lodge in paperwork and in memory, compel the investigator to keep looking, not for drama, but for a fuller accounting. It is at this point, with the evidence gathered from different years and different forms, the field notes, the magazine essays, oral histories, police records, that the narrative begins to open in more than one direction. One path leads to comparative folklore, to the mapping of motifs like the black dog and winged humanoid across the British Isles. Another path leads to the more modern inquiries, interviews with living witnesses, re-examination of archived reports, and attempts to reconcile physical data with testimony. A third path is theoretical, invoking notions of adaptive phenomenon or environmental triggers. Each path is a legitimate route of inquiry. None guarantees an answer. What follows next in this story is both the most mundane and the most unnerving. Further accounts, some from later decades, that seem to echo the earlier ones. Attempts by local authorities to quiet the rumour mill, and the slow work of researchers like Kevin Gates, who compiled oral histories and drew attention to the connections between the Bluebell Wood incident and the surrounding reports. He and periodicals such as the Flying Saucer Review made it easier for future investigators to follow the thread. But tracing a thread is only the beginning. The real test is in what you do with the pattern once you see it, whether you can turn these scattered human moments into a framework for understanding, without strangling them into a single tidy explanation. Before we push further into the later accounts and into attempts at analysis, pause for a moment with the image that started this whole set of inquiries. A gnarled tree in a bramble-ringed clearing, the air heavy with the tang of rot, and the two boys who smelled something wrong before they saw what lay at the roots. That scene is not a theatrical device. It is the lived, trembling beginning of a series of events that would ripple outward through the community for years. It matters because it anchors the narrative in a particular place and time, in human recollection and procedural record, and because it raises a basic question that will keep coming up as we continue. How do we account for the way certain places seem to collect the extraordinary? There are more stories to tell from the surrounding years, accounts of highway lights that moved in ways cars could not, later teenage reports of luminous shapes seen near motorway embankments, and other instances that knit themselves into the fabric of local lore. In the next stretch of this inquiry, we will go back to those later reports, examine them in closer detail, and begin to draw together the threads of folkloric motif, eyewitness testimony, and archival record. We will also look more closely at how researchers like Kevin Gates assembled these materials, and at the questions they raise about memory, motive, and method. For now, keep the image of Bluebell Wood in your mind, a small, ordinary patch of English woodland that in one cold spring became the pivot point for a cluster of strange and stubborn stories. If you've been pulled in this far, and you want more of these slow-burning oddities, take a second to subscribe. There's a lot more thread to follow in this part of Bedfordshire. After the Bluebell Wood clearing, and the early string of accounts I've already described, the record grows both denser and stranger in ways that don't make themselves tidy. People who lived within the map of Sundon Road, Clophill, Studham Common and the Dunstable Tunnel describe a steady accretion of small events. A sheepdog that refused to enter a certain field for days, headlights that brightened and then dimmed with no apparent cause, and farmers waking to find fences cut but no obvious tracks away from the scene. Many of these episodes were noted casually in parish minutes, or mentioned in passing in interviews I conducted, or read later in Kevin Gates' compilations. They tend to arrive the way local news does, in the cadence of the daily life interrupted. One particularly puzzling set of incidents came, as these things often do, in fragmentary fashion from people who were not professional witnesses, but who nevertheless left traces in official files. An RSPCA officer who attended the Bluebell Wood area recorded, in sober notes, that the heads had clean wounds inconsistent with typical scavenging. The police file shows entries that are procedural, times, vehicle numbers, names of officers. Those documents do not reach for dramatic conclusions. They merely press the event into the archive. But when those procedural notes sit beside an oral recollection, a woman who remembered a neighbor returning from a night shift with mud in a pattern that made others glance at him twice, or a man who swore his livestock was spooked the day before the heads were found. The archive starts to feel like a palimpsest, layers of formal observation and private unease laid over the same geography. Some later episodes repeat the motifs we've already seen, but tilt them in ways that complicate simple explanations. In one recorded instance from the early 1970s, documented in local folklore collections, and repeated to me by an elderly man who preferred the anonymity of a pub corner, a driver reported a streak of blue light crossing the road in front of his car on Sundon Road. He braked hard. There was no object, no debris, just a fleeting afterimage in his windshield and an immediate visceral sense that something had been very near. That blue light resonates, of course, with the Blue Man description from Studham Common in 1967, but the behaviours and consequences differ. Here, a vehicle almost stops. There's a near miss. In Studham, children tell of a luminous figure that vanishes in smoke. Those differences might suggest unrelated events, or they might be the phenomenon wearing different clothes for different audiences. A useful case study in the archive comes from interviews Kevin Gates gathered while researching what he titled Paranormal Diaries, Clophill. Gates collected oral histories from residents who had never intended their memories to be circulated widely. He treated them as testimonies, often unvarnished and sometimes contradictory. One interview I revisited stood out. A farmer who, years later, still insisted that he had seen a figure moving along the hedge line at dusk. Not a man, he said, but like something wearing a coat of shadow. He did not want to be labelled as fanciful, he simply reported the experience. Gates' work does not force these accounts into a single explanation. Instead, he lays them out and invites the reader to weigh consistencies and outliers. It's important to highlight how later investigators approach these materials. The Flying Saucer Review, that specialist magazine which published the Studham Common account among many others, tended to treat eyewitness testimony as evidence to be collated. They gave space to the 7 boys' essays, and those essays retain a consistency that made investigators sit up. Similar adjectives, similar sequence of events, similar sensory details. The magazine did not pronounce on causation. It recorded and allowed readers to form judgments. For many researchers, those pages became a point of departure. If you have a file with multiple independent statements that echo one another, the temptation is to see intentionality. The counter is to remember that retelling can reinforce and subtly alter memory. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, accounts that used animal motifs began to accumulate. The Colby Pope sighting in 1979, a child's report of a tall, winged creature that forced a group of kids into the shelter of a motorway tunnel, took on a life beyond the immediate witness statement. Colby's description was vivid: a large figure, broad wings or wing-like arms, an owlish visage. He and his companions fled as if they had encountered something predatory. In later years, folklorists and cryptozoology enthusiasts pointed to parallels in the so-called Mothman reports in the United States and to other British Owlman sightings. Those comparative threads offer insight but also carry risk. Matching motifs across locations can illuminate cultural patterns, communities borrowing a lexicon of fear. But it can also seduce investigators into seeing sameness where difference may be more instructive. The 1986 black dog encounter, reported by Tim Humphrey and his friend Tommy, adds another layer. The story, which circulates in local memory with a blend of dread and bemusement, is the one that most explicitly echoes older folk traditions: the black shuck of East Anglia, the hairy hands of Dartmoor, monstrous canines that cross lonely lanes. Tim and Tommy, veterans both, described a phenomenon that seemed to subvert ordinary physics. The dog's position shifted in a blink between the men's lines of sight, and fired rounds did not produce the results they expected. The tale ends without a trophy or a resolution. Tim later told interviewers that the episode was one among a set of disturbances that seemed to gather around his family for a period of time. He framed it as an uncomfortable coincidence rather than causation. Across all these accounts, certain motifs recur: a hush that presses down on ordinary sound, moments where sight is replaced by smell or by an impression of movement, the way animals behave as if aware of something humans cannot see. Those details are not glamorous in the way tabloid copywriters imagine. They are subtle, persistent, and significant precisely because they are not easily explained away by a single cause. They invite a multidisciplinary approach. Talk to the folklorist about motif distribution. Talk to the geophysicist about subterranean anomalies. Speak with the social historian about how small communities transmit fear. Geology, for instance, is a domain that often surfaces in careful investigations of anomalous clusters. Some researchers propose that pockets of unusual mineral composition can create low-frequency electromagnetic effects that, at least in laboratory settings, influence human perception and animal behavior. That suggestion does not explain precise surgical wounds on animal remains, nor does it comfortably account for consistent multi-witness essays from children. But as a working hypothesis, it is worth considering. If a landscape carries micro-variations that can alter nervous system responses, then under certain conditions, multiple people might report experiences that share structural similarities, even when no one event is literally the same as another. Another non-paranormal vector is social contagion. Reputation is a powerful magnet. Once a hamlet becomes known for odd happenings, every ambiguous stimulus, a lantern on a hedgerow, a bruise on a sheep, a reflection in a car mirror, risks being folded into the narrative. The psychological literature on memory shows how suggestion, once introduced, can shape subsequent recollection. That is one reason why contemporary investigators emphasize contemporaneous records. Diaries, farm logs, medical notes, police reports. They provide a temporal anchor that helps us separate what was observed close to the moment and what may have been restructured by retelling. Still, skepticism alone is insufficient if it becomes a form of dismissal. The RSPCA notes and the police files exist for a reason. Officers used clinical language in recording wounds and placements. Such dryness should not be mistaken for trivialization. When an officer notes that cuts appear surgical, that is a professional observation worth checking rather than ignoring. It is equally important, however, to resist the leap from cuts appear precise to, therefore, this was a ritual killing. There is a middle ground in which professional documentation is taken seriously, while hypotheses about motives or agency remain provisional. This is where Jacques Vallée's thinking becomes useful in a conceptual way. Vallée suggested, cautiously, that certain anomalous phenomena might behave like an intelligence that adapts its presentation, a masking behavior, if you will. That idea is not a conclusion. It is a methodological frame for asking why different reports in a single geography might nevertheless resemble manifestations of a single process. If you imagine the phenomenon as adaptive, then a luminous man, a black dog, and a winged figure could be expressions of a single underlying pattern that interfaces with cultural expectations. That model invites comparison rather than conflation. It recommends curiosity paired with skepticism. Curiosity to notice patterns, skepticism to avoid forcing unrelated events into one narrative. Applying Vallée's heuristic to Bedfordshire does not mean declaring a single cause. It means asking whether adaptive models help us make sense of variability. It also forces us to respect the diversity of evidence. A precise wound documented by an RSPCA officer is not the same type of data as a 7-boy essay published in Flying Saucer Review, but both are data. A measured investigative approach aims to weigh them together, to ask whether commonalities point toward a shared cause or toward convergent storytelling shaped by place and time. So far I've described patterns and frameworks. It's worth pausing and considering the limits of interpretation. First, the eyewitness archive is imperfect by nature. Memories degrade, narratives accrete detail in retellings, and community reputations can shape how later witnesses interpret ambiguous stimuli. Second, physical evidence, when it exists, requires forensic rigor. Without preserved samples subjected to modern testing, claims about the nature of wounds or biological anomalies remain provisional. Third, hypotheses about environmental triggers, human agency, or adaptive intelligence all carry different burdens of proof. None can be accepted without appropriate corroboration. But an investigator also has to wrestle with what to do when the archive is messy, yet persistent. For that reason, my approach in cases like Bluebell Wood is threefold. First, document everything with care and attribute everything precisely. Say who reported what, when, and under what circumstances. Second, test hypotheses where possible. If a site is suspected of geological anomalies, consult geophysicists. If animal remains suggest a particular tool or technique, consult veterinarians and forensic pathologists. Third, hold theory lightly. Allow multiple, overlapping explanations to coexist as working possibilities, rather than as mutually exclusive declarations. When I returned to the communities years after the initial incidents, what struck me was not merely the eerie details, but the ordinary ways people processed them. Neighbours exchanged recollections over cups of tea. Parish council minutes quietly added items like concern about livestock behaviour or suspicious activity reported near footpath. A local primary school teacher told me that for a time some children avoided walking home alone. She relayed that as a fact about behaviour, not as evidence for any particular supernatural thesis. Those social ripples matter because they demonstrate that the phenomena, whatever their origin, have tangible effects on community life. There is a final ethical dimension in retelling these stories that I cannot stress enough. The 12-year-old boys who discovered the heads in Bluebell Wood were children whose lives were altered, at least temporarily, by what they saw. Colby Pope was a child who later found his account circling through magazines and folk tales. Tim Humphrey and Tommy were real people whose encounter with something that behaved like a mythic hound left them shaken. Treat their testimonies with dignity. When a community remembers something painful, the responsible investigator bears witness without turning that pain into spectacle. What, then, can we reasonably conclude about Bluebell Wood and its surrounding landscape? The most defensible position is an open one. The data show a clustering of high strangeness reports across a relatively compact geography over a period of decades. The reports are diverse in form: animal mutilation, luminous figures, roadside presences, a large winged creature, a black dog, and they resist being reduced to a single, simple explanation. Some physical evidence recorded by authorities deserves further scientific attention, if preserved. Some oral histories are internally consistent in ways that suggest sincerity. Some patterns invite the application of theoretical models like Vallet's masking hypothesis. At the same time, social dynamics, memory, and potential hoaxing or misinterpretation remain viable counter-explanations. That tension between pattern and plurality, between the archivist's desire for clarity and the stubborn openness of lived memory, is precisely the space where serious inquiry must proceed. It is the space occupied by measured curiosity. Before I close, there are a few practical notes that matter if you want to explore this topic further. Primary sources include the RSPCA and police incident files from 1963, which provide the kind of procedural detail that anchors testimony to time and place. Kevin Gates's book Paranormal Diaries, Clophill collects a trove of oral histories and is an accessible entry into the local texture of the events. The Flying Saucer Review issue that published the Studham Common account remains a key reference for those specific essays. Local guides such as Haunted Luton and Haunted Bedford have gathered folklore and recollections that supplement formal records, though they should be read as compilations rather than as forensic truth. Where possible, compare those secondary sources with contemporaneous newspaper clippings and archival parish records. What I hope listeners take away from this inventory is less an answer than a method. Treat claims with respectful curiosity. Attribute carefully. Seek corroboration where possible. Allow for multiple working hypotheses. Recognize the human cost of sensationalizing what may be, at its core, a community's wound and memory. That posture will not yield fireworks or dramatic certainties, but it will keep you honest and attentive to complexity. So what lurks in Bluebell Wood? The short, unsatisfying answer is something that remains at the level of evidence, unresolved. The longer, more useful answer is a register of anomalous experiences, some recorded by officers, some by children, some by adults, clustered in a geographical and social space that invites further, multidisciplinary study. Whether you lean toward environmental causes, social explanation, or a model of adaptive phenomenon, the ground rules remain: attribute, verify, and hold interpretation lightly. If this account stirred something in you, a memory, a family story, or a question, share it below. I'm especially interested in archival leads, old photographs, parish minutes, or police folios that might still be accessible. For those who want deep dives, the description includes links to the sources I've used and a small Patreon where I post extended documents and annotated readings from the archives. Credits, source material and inspiration for this investigation include Kevin Gates, Paranormal Diaries, Clophill, accounts published in the Flying Saucer Review, local compilations such as Haunted Luton and Haunted Bedford, and official notes from RSPCA and police archives referenced where appropriate. My thanks to the residents who shared memories and to the archive custodians who preserved those records. In the end, the woods remain as they were. A low stand of trees between fields, a path worn by years of feet, a gnarled tree that once marked a clearing pressed flat by something that left a smell and a memory. The shock of that discovery in 1963 echoes because people tell the story. It endures because the place, like any place, collects what is said about it. Whether that collection points to a window, a series of unrelated events, or the enduring power of narrative, I leave to you to weigh. Thank you for listening. If you want to see the documents and source notes that informed this episode, check the description below. If you enjoyed this exploration, consider subscribing and supporting the channel so we can keep pulling at threads like this. Above all, tell us, have you ever had an experience that changed how you saw a place? I read every comment.